It's really great to be back at the Gunmakers Fair. This is it's so good that this is being continued on here at the Kempton community grounds here, and the venue here is great. We've got a lot of room. We've got a lot of great seminars for you guys this year, as well as demos. So I hope you'll take advantage of as many as you can. I'm going to talk along with BJ Habermahl, and my name is Dave Person. Some of you, if you're on the ALR website, I'm on there as Smart Dog. BJ, you were there on BJ, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And our task today is to talk about the sequence of what you do to build any kind of muzzleloading gun. We're not talking about the actual methods of doing each of these steps. That's not the point. The point is, what's the sequence? BJ and I had this conversation maybe way back in like 5 years ago or more.
At least.
About noticing folks sometimes get confused. When do I put my barrel lugs in? When do I drill my barrel lugs? When do I put the butt plate on? When do we put the trigger in place? And we figured out, looking at some of the questions that come in on the ALR site and the muzzleloading forum, it looked like there were a lot of people who were confused or were unsure of how to proceed in making most muzzleloading guns. And so we decided, this presentation would be on the sequencing of what you do, or at least in this case, the sequencing of what we do. In my case, my Braintree Hill gun shop, which is myself and my apprentice, Maria Gray, and BJ, who also works he's worked for Lepley.
No, I was working with Fred Miller.
Fred Miller, yeah. So we both have quite a bit of experience, and these are kind of the sequences of things that work for us. And one of the things that I'll emphasize is that the sequence of events that you proceed with when you're building a gun can have a major effect on the quality of your work. Because one, it makes it more efficient. Two, it makes it in such a way that you don't have to go back and redo stuff. And this is really kind of important, because if you want to do crisp, clean work, oftentimes that's accomplished not just by the individual procedures and methods in cutting and sanding and scraping the wood, but also when you do it and what comes after. These are important key points in gun building. Now I'm going to emphasize building a gun from a plank of wood, all right? BJ is going to talk about some of the differences you might think about when you are now dealing with a pre-carved stock, because he's had a lot of experience building from pre-carved stocks. There are some differences. The procedures are a little different because the pre-carved's got a lot more work done for you. So without any more ado, I'm going to get started. Unfortunately, I have to run this from the keyboard, so I kind of have to stand here. If folks over there, if I'm blocking your view, I'd urge you to move over, because I have to be able to run. Yeah. Hey, Eric. I have to kind of work from the keyboard here. So anyway, so we're going to talk about the sequencing. And let me get down here. There we go. And one thing I do want to emphasize is there's no one correct method of doing this. I mean, everybody has different ways of skinning a cat. But in my case, and in BJ's case, we've done a lot of these guns. We make guns fairly efficiently. And these have worked for us. And we think they're going to be somewhat utilitarian for you guys, too. To emphasize that, my firearms are known for clean work and for a certain elegance to them. And part of that is wrote by the way I do them in procedures in terms of the sequencing. Not actually the actual work, it helps to have the right sequence, and I can almost do that in my sleep if I use the right sequence of work.
Well, I found that from my toolmaking and machinist background, every manufactured item, whether it be one of these things or a gun, there's a distinct order of operations. And as Dave says, sequencing. But the order of operations, you got to start somewhere. That's the biggest thing. And where you start is the important thing.
Yeah. So where we start, when I build a gun, the first thing I do is research. Now I know there's a lot of folks who start right off the bat on the stock, and that's okay if you're building the same gun over and over again. There's a lot of folks who could build a Lehigh probably in their sleep. The only gun that I can build sort of in my sleep is a Brown Bess musket, because they're basically the same and I do them over and over again. But my shop has an eclectic array of projects that we work on. Anything from the 15th century to the early 19th century. So we're always building new and different guns. And as a result, we never really wrote in any single one of them. So research is really important, and research in museums, research in collections, research online. Be a little bit careful when you're doing research online, because you got to kind of vet the quality of the work that you're actually seeing and the sort of honesty of the work you're kind of seeing. Books are incredibly important as well. There's some great reference books out there to give you really good, clear descriptions of what you're trying to make. So it's important to do that research if you intend to make something that looks authentic, if you intend to make something that is, you actually have an objective where it's going to look like a Lehigh Valley gun, or it's going to look like a Brown Bess musket, or it's going to look like a Hawken rifle. It really pays to do that research. And I spend a lot of time doing research on every one of my pieces. I probably spend about 10% of my time on the whole project just getting the research done. Make a drawing. Unless you have made lots and lots of guns, it will save you tears in the end if you make a drawing of the gun you're planning to make before you ever start putting anything in the wood or any tool to the wood. It doesn't have to be a fancy drawing, but at least it should show where all your parts are going to go. So this is after you've collected your parts. Make your drawing so you can see, is the ramrod going to hit the front lock bolt? Is there enough room underneath the ramrod so I can break through to the bottom of the stock? Does the lock fit the stock? Does the lock look good in the profile of the stock? These are all kinds of considerations that can be solved by a drawing, and then later on you don't have to worry about it, because if you follow your drawing, you've already got that all figured out. It'll save you tears in the end. Oops. So I'm going to talk about starting from a blank, and one of the recommendations I would make when you are starting from a blank, if you're going to use some sort of assist from a router table or a table saw or anything that's going to cut your barrel channel, or it's going to cut your ramrod groove, and of course putting in the barrel is about the first task we do. But prior to that, if you're going to use any power assist, you probably have to square up your stock. So the first thing you're going to want to do, and this is my apprentice Maria, you're going to want to plane or sand your plane or draw knife your stocks to square them up top and bottom, so that if you're going to run them across a fence, along a fence, you've got a nice square side and bottom to do that with. If you're going to start from if you're going to just do everything basically by hand without any kind of assist from a power tool like a table saw or a router table, then it's probably a good idea. You can just go ahead without really squaring up right away. Just you can have at it and put your barrel in and put your ramrod groove in. So it's not really necessary to square up at this point, but there will be a time in the future in which squaring up the stock is going to pay off big dividends. So if you're not going to do that, if you're going to do everything by hand, okay, your barrel goes in, and your ramrod groove, ultimately your ramrod hole goes after that. And notice I didn't say anything about barrel lugs. Just the barrel, the ramrod groove, the ramrod hole. Then I install the breech plug, whether it's a standing breech or just a plain breech plug like this one here. And once that's installed, I trim a tremendous amount of wood off the stock. In fact, I try to trim everything back to maybe no more than about 3/16 extra, maybe 1/8 inch extra wood all around. That's about it. Everything else comes off. And it's particularly important when we get to putting on in the lock, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But we trim off a lot of wood off those stocks. And this is the typical stock. I haven't actually trimmed off the lock panels yet, but they'll be a lot thinner too. But we don't do any other tasks until we've trimmed that extra wood off. And at that point, we square up all that wood, And we'll go ahead and put in our center lines, which would then also map out any kind of cast on or cast off you might be applying to the gun stock. But it's really important to have the stock square, at least two sides square, so that you can take accurate measurements. And that's going to be important in the next few steps. So this is the time to consider putting in your ramrod pipes, putting in your barrel lugs and drilling for them, and putting in your lock. Now, it's really important to have accurate measurements when you put in your barrel pins or your barrel keys, because you've got to take measurements along the side to locate where the pins are going to go. And if your stock is squared off, you can do that much more easily than if you have to figure out some, ersatz way of figuring out where the hole's going to start because the barrel side isn't square and you have nothing to measure against that you can actually get an accurate depiction of where that hole is going to go relative to the barrel lug. So it's a good idea to square things up, make sure they're perpendicular, at least two sides are perpendicular. And then you can put in your pipes, you can do your barrel lugs, and you can do your lock. Now there's nothing more foolish, in my opinion, than inletting a lock with too much wood left. So that lock's got to set down in like an 1/8 inch of wood. I'll say right now, it's stupid to do it that way. Because one, every time you put that in and out, you risk chipping off wood, and you're going to take that lock plate in and out a hell of a lot. You're going to do that over and over and over again in the life of the build. And every time you do that, if you've got too much wood hanging over that lock plate, you risk chipping wood out. Trim that wood down to just maybe no more than a 1/16 of an inch, more than it has to be. And even that, you can even go to a 32nd. Secondly, you cannot see gaps with that thick wood above the lock plate. You can't see it. If you use inletting black, guarantee you're going to smear inletting black all over the edge, and it's going to look like a gap. You'll think you have a gap there. You don't really know if you have a gap there. It really is not a good way to proceed, and you're going to do a lot more crisp, tight inletting if you make sure you pare down that wood before you ever start. Second thing here I want to make a point about lock. You notice on that example here, there is no vent hole yet. I don't understand why people drill the vent hole and then try to position your lock. Do it the other way around. Position the lock first, just make a mark on the barrel where the vent hole is going to go. Inlet your lock. Putting in a vent hole is the last task I ever do on a gun, period. Very last task. Because it's a heck of a lot easier to put that vent hole in the right place relative to the lock that's already inlet than it is to put it on the barrel first and try to get that lock to fit there as you're inletting it. So I recommend that you do not drill a vent hole. Just make a mark on the barrel, inlet your lock just as you would, and you'll drill your vent hole near the very end of the process of building. So at this point, what I've said is fairly conventional. Probably you talk to most makers, they would probably proceed in a similar way. But here's where my shop tends to diverge from a lot of people, a lot of builders. We get to this point, the stock is squared off, trimmed off wood, we've got the lock in there, we've got the pipes in there, we've got the barrel lugs in there. In my shop, we go straight to shaping the stock and actually shaping it down close to final form before we put the trigger in, before we put the butt plate on, and definitely before we put the trigger guard on, all right? Or a toe plate, or even a muzzle cap. We trim off a lot of wood and shape it before we ever put those components in place. Other people will fit the stock, when it's still square, they'll fit all the hardware on it. And in my opinion, that makes for trouble, because if you have to change anything, specifically if, let's say, you've pinned your trigger guard, you install it, you pin it, you've installed your trigger and you've pinned it. If you decide all of a sudden, oh, that's not exactly what I want, and this particularly happens when you're going from squared to round, because even if you've got a good drawing, that two-dimensional image starts to look a little different when it becomes three-dimensional, because of the shadows and the textures that are created by the actual architecture of the stock. And you say, oh yeah, I need to make it a little thinner underneath the trigger, or I gotta get that curve down the butt plate a little bit different. All those things will almost inevitably happen in most builds, And if you've got a trigger that's already pinned, and you've got a trigger guard that's installed and already pinned, you're kind of out of luck if you're going to change that, because you got to either re-drill those holes or you got to fill the holes in the trigger. And I'm going to show you an example. Okay, so the gun on the top, you should all recognize this as a Kibler kit. You know, that's a classic Kibler kit. I'm only using it here as an example because it's something in which everything is already locked in for you. You basically can't hardly change anything. So as if you started with a squared off stock, you put all the hardware on there, you know, that's where you would be, although this of course is a finished gun. So you've got everything locked in, right? Well, now in this case, I don't particularly care for this piece up here on a Kibler stock. You see that kind of hump right there? Because the tang comes back straight here, and it's got a very deep throat. I don't like that. I wanted to change that. Well, you got a real problem here because the trigger's pinned for you. The trigger guard's inlet and pinned for you. How do you change that? Well, the way you have to change that in that situation is on that trigger, you pull it out and you weld over the hole, and then you reshape the stock, and then you drill through the existing hole there into that trigger now that doesn't have a hole in it anymore. The same thing with the trigger guard. You finish it up and change it. Yes?
What if your end result is a specific length of pull? Wouldn't you set your lock and trigger first and then?
I'm getting there. So in this particular case, by having it squared up like and putting all your hardware in, you've got nowhere to go. If you wait and do some shaping first, you can still make adjustments before you put in and lock yourself in to putting all that hardware. I honestly don't know why people teach building stocks from square, putting everything in and then start shaping. I don't understand that logic at all. And here's just those two guns, and I'll argue, you know, I mean, people have, it's all subjective, but I would say that the gun on the bottom there is more elegant. But I had to make some changes to a gun that everything was locked in place, and it becomes more difficult. It's so much easier to make those changes when everything isn't locked in place. So what happens? Well, we shape the wrist, we shape the forestocks, we get things down to a pretty close to final form before we proceed with any more installation of hardware. So the stock is going to start to look like, you know, a gun, and a gun getting close to finish. Yeah.
Now, when we're working from a pre-carve, we have a little difference in how things need to be done. Pre-carves, everything, when a person needs to build it off of, you need to build it off the breech face of the barrel. Okay, you got to establish exactly where that breech face is. You may have to move the barrel back in the stock to get the breech face to line up with an existing mortise. If you do that, and you have to do that, then that's what we have to do. We have to either move it back, move it down, whatever, to get that breech face in the right place according to wherever the carver has the lock mortise. If you're going to do a pre-carve, I suggest make life a lot easier for yourself. Leave off the lock, have the carver leave off the lock mortise. Do that yourself. But the big thing is working off the breech face of the barrel. That's, I should say, the face of the breech plug. You have to establish that. Of course, if you're doing a pre-carve, first thing you gotta do is breech up the barrel. I'll even check one of Rice's breeches or any of the rest of them to make sure that they're breeched up properly to suit me. The next thing is, Dave was talking about shaping the people that shape stuff up. And now Dave's got a pre-carved stock for all intents and purposes, and he is going to start putting his hardware on. Typically when I do a pre-carve, I'll have the barrel in, I'll do the lock, I'll get the trigger established, then I find the butt plate and move that in. I've gotten away from doing pre-carves because of the nightmares that I've gotten into with butt plates. I'll let Dave have things from here.
Yeah, I know that too well, BJ. Anyway, thanks, BJ. That's okay. So now this is getting to your question. All right. So now at this point, I'm going to put the trigger in. And one of the reasons why I find it important to put the trigger in and dealing with length of pull when the stock is shaped, is part of that length of pull is not just the distance between that trigger and the crescent of the butt plate. It's also the thickness of the wrist. If you got little hands and you have a thick wrist, you might want a shorter length of pull, all right? You don't know that if that stock's squared up. You don't know that feeling's going to be there until that stock is rounded and shaped. So in this case, after the shaping, I'll put the trigger in. It's not pinned. It's just in the slot. I'll put the trigger plate in. It's not pinned. Of course, it is bolted into the tang from the barrel. And then I'll put the butt plate on. And I make sure that the butt section is trimmed down enough so I don't have a whole lot of excess wood on either side of that butt plate. That just makes it tough to see how the butt plate's fitting if you've got this big thick piece of wood there. So I have it trimmed down to just a little bit more than the width of the butt plate, and then I install the butt plates. And once the butt plate's installed, then we can really accurately measure length of pull, also because the wrist is rounded, so we can make a much greater assessment of how it's going to feel. And it's at this stage I like to have the eventual owner of the gun come to the shop, if they can, and for a fitting, because then they really are going to know what this gun's going to feel like. And it's a real benefit to have somebody be able to come in and feel it and see if that's exactly what they want and how it works. And Kurt, you know all about that. Anyway, let me go to the next one. Okay, so then I finally bring the gun down to about this condition, which is for someone who doesn't want to decorate the stock. Basically, this would be where you would just start to sand and scrape and get ready to put on finish. You'd really be almost to the finished state in terms of the form of it, the architecture of the gun stock, and the shape of the wood surface. It's at this point I'll consider putting in the trigger guard. And at this point I'll consider pinning the trigger, not before. So everything is done before without those things mounted or pinned. At this point, the gun is about where it's going to be. Then I will pin the trigger. Then I will install the trigger guard, and I will go ahead and pin the trigger at that point. Now, once we got there, and there shows a trigger installation, that's a set trigger in the top there, on top left. So at this point, the gun stock is pretty smooth. You know, you could go from here to final sanding and staining if you wanted to. But we're going to talk a little bit about, okay, now when you put in the lock panels, if you're going to do lock moldings like the beaver tails, or you're going to do carving, or you're going to put in silver wire inlay, any of that decorative work, or decorative inlays. Well, it's at this stage that you would consider doing that. And for example, it's at this stage of completion that I would consider starting to cut the lock moldings, not before. Essentially, if any of you have ever built a Kibler kit, the shape the Kibler kit comes to you is about the roughest that I would consider before I would start cutting lock moldings in, all right? You don't cut these in too early. If you cut the lock molding in when the stock is still fairly square, like the lower right here, you tend to end up with this sort of blocky picture frame, clunky look, as opposed to the lock panels actually blending with the architecture of the stock and actually looking like a part of the stock rather than something that's sort of glued on the side. And this is a typical beginner's mistake, is to try to take a chisel, go around the lock panels when the stock is still fairly square, and cut those in. They think they have to remove the wood. No, you shape the wood in the contours that it's going to finally be, and then you will cut in the lock panels, and you're going to relieve a very little bit of wood around the shoulders of those lock panels. You're not going to be digging in deep. Yeah?
Are your lock bolts in?
Yes, lock bolts are in. Yes. Yeah. Lock bolts went in when the lock went in. So it's at this stage that I would cut those beaver tails on the lock panels. The gun is, like I say, almost nearing completion. This is also the stage I put side plates in, patch box. I cut my molding along the ramrod groove, and I might put in a wrist plate. Some of those decorative inlays, again, there's really almost no excess wood left on the stock now. You're really getting down almost to the point where the gun is finished. And then these components would go in, not before. And then finally, when you get to the last decorative bits, if I was going to carve the gun, then I would start carving it when I've done sanding, initial sanding, or scraping that's getting it close to final form. I've got everything mounted, I've got my lock panels done, I've got some of those major architecture features like the edge of the cheek piece carved, the ramrod groove moldings done. Then I would consider actually carving the stock behind the cheek piece, carving it behind the barrel tang if the objectives of this project demanded that. And the wood is, like I say, almost near finished before you start. And I have a way of doing this. I'm not sure how many other people do this, but when I do the carving, the final carvings, I carve the backgrounds and relieve, I carve the basic outlines, and then I relieve the backgrounds. And once that's done, I stop. I don't do any more carving. I just get the basic outlines, the raised wood and relieved backgrounds done. And then I start whiskering the stock. And when I whisker a stock, I put a yellow, orange, red, or red aniline dye, very dilute. I paint the whole stock. I love this part of gun building because I usually email the owner, eventual owner, with a picture. Hey, I painted your gun orange. And I used to have a guy who used to drop stuff in the woods when he was hunting all the time and lose it. So I painted his orange, and I sent him an email and said, "You won't lose this now." So it's a really good technique. So it picks up all the scratches, all the little dings, all the little rough areas that you might have to clean up, as well as whiskers the wood, because it's a water-based dye, a water-based stain. So the wood grain is going to rise on you. Scrape it back or sand it back to clean that off, smooth it off. Do that a couple times so the grain doesn't rise. And once all that grain is off, and you know that you've covered the entire stock when all the color is gone, you haven't missed a spot. So when the color goes, and you've done this maybe a couple times to raise the grain, then I'll carve the details in the carving so that there's no risk that that carving is going to fuzz up when I put on a water-based stain at the end of this project, or any other stain I might put on it. And that's when I'll put in all that detail. And this is also when I would consider doing silver wire inlay. Silver wire inlay you want to do because you basically want to be at the level of the wood that it's going to be finished at before you put the wire in. So this is the point when you would do something like that. And then you go ahead and you're finally ready for stain. And once it's been whiskered, once you've done your carving, once you've done all that other decorative work, it's time to put on your stain, whether it's a water-based stain, alcohol-based stain, it doesn't matter. It's all going to be the same for you. In terms of staining, I do use, for example, on maple, I will use ferric nitrate, which is the same thing as aquafortis, nitric acid with iron dissolved in it. But I, instead of, if you use ferric nitrate powder and dissolved in water, theoretically you don't have to neutralize it afterwards, neutralize the acid, paint it with either lye water or ammonia or baking soda. Generally you can just leave it go, that's the theory. I don't. I always give it a coat of some basic solution just to be sure, just so that maybe in 100 years, things haven't sort of still become, still acidic. Although I'm told that is redundant. It's not something you really need to do. Other stains, of course, you generally don't have to worry about that. But there is one advantage with ferric nitrate or aquafortis, something for you guys to remember. If you're going to go and put it on, and you are going to neutralize it, if you use lye water, just basically lye dissolved in water, when you paint that on, your aquafortis color, the tiger stripe color in the maple, will turn a little bit redder. It's a shocking change that can be made. So there is an advantage to doing that, even if it's really not called for. I'll just tell you a little story. I built an Edward Marshall, a close copy of an Edward Marshall rifle, and I was desperately trying to get the color of the original as close as I could. And so the original is kind of orangey and light colored, and I thought, wow, I'll dilute my ferric nitrate solution, dilute it. And I diluted it to a point where on a piece of test wood, it looked okay. I hit it with the heat gun to blush basically aquafortis. And I thought, okay, I'm there. So I paint the stock, and this gun was a real special gun, and I'd worked really hard on this thing.
paint the whole gun. And I blush it. And it comes out this sort of barn gray color that looked like somebody had taken magenta spray paint and thinly sprayed it all over the stock. It was horrible. This was a real eye-opener. I mean, I was like, holy cow, I ruined this thing. Well, I put the lye water on it, and boom, the color I wanted, right then and there. I was like so happy, what a save. So it does work, and it is a good technique to use, even if you don't really have to neutralize. I think the lye water isn't a bad way to go. Anyway, just for the color. Anyway, at this point we apply stain and then finish, whatever finish you guys choose. At this point you're going to put your finish on. Now, something to remember with finish, there are finishes that dry very quickly. Chambers oil dries, permalin dries quickly. Polymerized tung oil dries very quickly. True oil dries very, very quickly. Don't be fooled when you're finishing a stock that your stock is dry just because it feels dry to touch. Always wait 24 hours before you put your next coat on, because if you don't do that, what's going to happen is the new coat is actually going to suck some of the old coat out, and you're basically going to have to put more coats on the wood than if you let them dry thoroughly before adding new coats. So in this case with polymerized tung oil, which is what I use, when that's applied, I apply it on and then I let it sit for about 15 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes, and then I wipe it off completely. Every bit of excess in every nook and cranny. When I do that, if I haven't let the previous coat dry thoroughly for 24 hours, I'm actually sucking some of that older coat finish out of the wood. So let it cure, let it dry very, very solidly before you add coats. And what you'll find is you'll get the finish done faster. And it won't feel gummy in any shape or form. So be patient with finishes, and if you can get a gun stock outside for finishing in the sun, it's a real advantage because UV light will dry it very, very quickly for you. Finally, the last point I want to make is for those of you who do want to do things like checkering, there's a consideration here in terms of sequence. In checkering, if you're going to do more modern or later English style checkering in which the diamonds are relatively small, it's always best to put 2 coats of finish at least on the wood and let them dry thoroughly, and actually let them dry more than 24 hours. Let them dry for a week or so they start to really cure. The reason for that is that the finish will then solidify the wood, harden it, and it reduces the risk that when you cut the diamonds, you chip one off. Because the bare wood, especially with the small, sharp diamonds, there's a real risk that as you cut new ones a little deeper, you're going to chip off the old ones. So the best thing to do in that situation is to put a couple coats of wood, finish on the wood first, let it really cure, then go to any checkering you're going to do. However, if you're going to do the early course checkering, the early course English checkering, that's cut actually not with a standard checkering tool, it's cut with a little tool that almost looks like a saw. And it's actually really you're sawing lines across the wood. I find that is best if you do that before you put stain or finish on the wood. That's best to do early on in the game before you do any staining or finishing. But modern checkering or later English checkering, you want to put a couple coats of wood on. And BJ, that's all I have. I'm happy to take questions. If you want to add anything, BJ, go ahead. These are just some of the guns I've done in the past. Every one of those essentially, using the procedures that I just outlined for you guys today. Yeah?
Why is pretty strong stuff? How dilute? What kind of ratio are you using? You can just neutralize it.
You're talking about the lye water?
Yeah.
I'm using probably about a an eighth of a cup of lye in maybe a cup of water, cup and a half of water. Okay. Yeah, it's about that. I kind of go. That looks about right. Put the water in. But it's not real critical what the concentration is, as long as you got enough concentration that it does what it's supposed to do. I don't think you can go too much in terms of lye, but probably like an eighth of a cup of lye, or maybe a quarter cup of lye, and then
heaping tablespoon of lye.
Yeah. Well, I do 2 heaping tablespoons, and then in a cup of water, basically. That's about right. Yeah.
I I know a fellow that does ramrod hole first.
Right.
And then does test borings to assure that the web in the back.
Right.
And he claims there is advantage to that so that the ramrod hole doesn't go off course and go through the bottom channel of his barrel inlet.
So he's doing his barrel in after he does his ramrod groove and hole?
That's correct.
Yeah, I mean, that might not be a bad idea. I bet you he doesn't do that without having a plan for the gun.
No, he has a full plan.
Yeah. I mean, if you have a full plan for the gun, so you know where that barrel is going to go, that would.
I'm doing a Jacob Picker.
Great.
And I have the original. I spent the day with doing full measure drawings, making it, and I have a full drawing.
Right.
And I was considering doing that because I have a great piece of maple, but I don't have a lot of extra width to fool around with.
Right.
So I was thinking about doing that hole first, and then I can position my.
Yeah, I mean, that might work okay. I've not done it that way, but I don't think that's a bad idea. Let me give you a little extra tip.
Sure.
That may, and it doesn't matter whether you're doing the ramrod hole first or later. Anytime you do the ramrod hole, when you get ready to cut the ramrod hole, cut the step in the stock where the stock's going to come down for the rear ramrod pipe. Cut that where the end of the ramrod pipe is going to be, the forward end. All right. So so that whole length of the ramrod pipe ultimately is going to be removed eventually. All right. Start your hole way up there, because what will happen is as you start to drill in that hole, monitor it, because you'll be able to see if maybe it's starting to deviate a little bit because the point of the drill didn't hit right, or it's not going in quite the way you want it. And what you can do now, because you have that chunk of wood in front where the ramrod pipe is, which is going to get cut away anyway, you just cut that first section off and you start to drill again.
Oh.
And you keep going back and back and back till you get to actually where the step in the stock is going to be. And that just gives you a couple of do-overs.
I'm doing this in the Living History Museum.
Right.
So we'll be doing it with a racing bit.
Yeah, that's the way I do it. I get in trouble with an electric drill. What's that?
I'll make mistakes a lot slower that way.
Yeah. And doing what I said about making your starting where the ramrod pipe begins, you can shorten it every time, and you can look at it and see, is it going the way I want it? And then you can make course corrections. Yeah.
I will use that.
Yeah. I always try to figure out ways to do things so that I always have a second chance. I mean, I need second chances sometimes.
I want to go all the way to the beginning. I cut down a sugar maple a few years ago, and have 3-inch slabs, planks. What part of the tree, like this tree, have slabs on the side, partwood? What part of the planks go on?
I would try to stay away from the center of the tree if you could.
Okay, so
I mean,
stay
it's,
away from the hardwood. And
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've seen a lot of stocks. I even have one now. It's cherry. Cherry doesn't generally grow all that big, except outside parts of Pennsylvania. And so you always end up getting fairly curved grain when you slab saw it. And you have to watch it because it checks really bad sometimes, and it can cup on you. You'll kind of go horizontally and cup on. But if you can stay away from that center wood, you're going to be better
Away
off.
from the center wood. Now, if this is your plank, what about laying out the wrist for strength? Is that
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I generally like to, ideally, you would have the grain of the woods curving down with the wrist. That would be ideal. But don't be too concerned if you see these V's of grain. What you look at the top of the blank rather than the sides. When you slab saw a piece of wood, which is actually, pretty strong way to cut wood is a slab saw. Don't think everything has to be quarter sawed. You'll get those V's. And you almost can't help it. And you think, I've got run out here in the wrist. Look at the top and the bottom, and often what will happen is that grain will be perfectly straight on the top and bottom. You're okay. You're good. You're good to go. Yeah. Jim.
Do you have a method of adjusting or determining your trigger pull if you don't have the owner in the shop?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a measuring
Right.
method?
Right. Well, one way I do that is if the person's got a favorite gun that they like, whether it's a modern or muzzleloader, I have them send a picture to me, especially if it's something like a standard modern gun that I can get measurements on a model. That's one way I do that. The other way is I have him take some measurements on his length of pull, from the elbow to the fingertip. It's almost always an overstatement of it. It generally ends up with a longer trigger pull. But knowing that, I'll figure, it's going to be, if this was 14 and a half, his trigger pull is going to probably be 13 and 3/4, maybe even 13 and 5/8. I know that you make that adjustment, especially if I'm making a gun that's going to have a pretty robust wrist. So those are about the best things I can do when I
The other thing
can't.
is to bring, we got a distance customer that you're meeting occasionally, bring a gun and go from there. Bring it
Yeah.
already,
Yeah, I mean, if somebody can bring a gun that fits them well, they like it, that's always a real positive thing. Yeah, that helps a lot. And then you can kind of take some of those points of measurement off of that.
but are you adjusting that with the trigger and trigger guard placement rather than the length of the butt?
If you're thinking, Jim, how that might affect the proportions, I'm generally putting that trigger. I put a trigger guard on, not thinking too much about the butt itself, the shape of the butt. I put the trigger guard on so there's plenty of room in front of the trigger for the guy to have. If he's hunting in wintertime, he can get a glove finger in there. If it's a set trigger, I try to move that rear set really close to the back of the bow of the trigger guard so he has plenty of room in the front to get a trigger in there, a finger in there, without ever hitting that set front trigger, as far as a safety issue. So as much as I can, and there's some trigger guards you can't do that with very well, but as much as I can, I try to provide as much space in front of the trigger for the finger. Now, there are always restrictions to that because of the shape of the trigger guard. And if I'm trying to meet an objective of a historical gun, then I got to live with it. I got to do what they did. So, that's the best answer I can give you. It's kind of an organic process, the whole works. There's no one rule of thumb I can use except to make it work. The end result is it's got to fit and it's got to work and be safe. Any other questions? Well, guys, thank you all.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.